I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. Take a moment to kind of like refresh our bodhicitta motivation, the reason for coming together today is that, especially so like grounded in love and compassion, a sense of universal responsibility, altruistic responsibility, and the wish to achieve enlightenment for the welfare of all sentient. And then, so actually, right, in order to achieve enlightenment, one thing Lama Tsongkhapa is teaching in his Lama room, stages of the path, is that in order to achieve enlightenment, one has to generate calm abiding, meditative concentration of calm abiding, and so we're studying it for that reason, right? Because actually, it's possible to achieve calm abiding not conjoined with bodhicitta or the wisdom understanding, or aimed at the wisdom understanding emptiness, and then that doesn't lead to enlightenment. Right? Calm abiding by itself doesn't. Isn't it? Calm abiding by itself doesn't cause enlightenment, but it's a necessary condition for enlightenment. If you're on the path, like if you're trying to achieve enlightenment, it's a necessary condition. But if you have calm abiding without bodhicitta, without the wisdom understanding emptiness, it doesn't lead to enlightenment by itself. But if you're on the path and trying to achieve enlightenment, then you need that capacity of mind, right? That kind of meditative concentration in order to achieve enlightenment. And so we left off on page 223, where we're kind of, Lama Tsongkhapa is presenting many different points about how do you develop calm abiding. And one side note I'll make. Last night I was sort of studying, looking at Lama Tsongkhapa's text and at various commentaries to it, and it's actually remarkable what he does in this, where he brings together, instructions from many different other sources, especially Indian sources on calm abiding. Because, and I've said before, he sort of addresses, how do you develop calm abiding and what mistakes can you make on the way to calm abiding? And he really addresses that deeply. It was like looking at it, I was realizing he takes parts of teachings, he takes teachings on this topic, let's put it that way, from Maitreya's treatises and from Kamalashila's stages of meditation. Of course, partly this is based on Atisha's Lamrim, the Lamp for the Path, and so on, and teachings also by Asanga on concentration, and teachings from Shantideva. Right, so he takes because each of them sort of might address a certain point a little more deeply or something like that, or present it in a slightly different way. So he sort of takes the best of all those different explanations of how you do calm abiding and sort of weaves them together to make it extra clear. So it's quite a gift, actually, that he does it that way, rather than sometimes it's just presented very briefly, but he really kind of goes into detail and sort of borrows or uses the deepest points of all these other explanations in order to create a very deep teaching on how to develop calm. So we were in the section on, and overcoming laxity and excitement, and how one does that. Actually, and he had explained how one, the specific methods for stopping laxity and specific methods for stopping excitement. Um, yeah, so I'll just pick up there. And so, where we left off, he had just said a point, he was making a couple points here. One is, if you think that you can develop like if somebody were to think, oh, I can develop calm abiding, but I don't have to take effort, like I can just relax right from the beginning, he's saying that's not correct. It takes effort. And then he's saying also that as you progress in your practice of calm abiding, you have to use that tool of introspection, right, to identify, he says here, to identify even subtle laxity and subtle excitement. And you have to overcome them through effort. And then he's getting at a subtle point here, because there are some beautiful verses, actually, like, I think there's one by Padampa Sangye, I think it is, the great Indian yogi. I can't remember the exact wording of it, he doesn't use it here, but it's just, I think it's these kinds, there are many quotes like this, where Padampa Sangye, I think it is, says something like, he says something like, just relax, and let go. And sort of there's an effortless quality to meditation. And what Lama Tsongkhapa is pointing out here is that's a correct instruction. He's not criticizing those kinds of instructions. But we'll get into this in a minute. There are like 9 levels of meditative concentration. And he's saying that instruction applies to a certain one of those levels, where you must do that to achieve calm abiding. And he's saying, but sometimes it's implied in what he's saying, that sometimes people apply that at the wrong point. Does that make sense? Like if you apply that too early, then you won't develop calm. Like there's a point where you have to make effort, and then there comes a point where you don't have, actually I'll use a metaphor for a second. Like if an eagle, like a bald eagle, were standing on the ground, and it just let its wings out like this, it's not going to soar, right? It's just going to flop down on the ground. It has to make effort, like flapping its wings. Then there comes a point when it's very high up, where continuing to flap its wings would no longer be useful, and then it can just spread its wings and effortlessly glide, right? And so that's my own metaphor. But I think it's a reasonable metaphor, right? Like, if you're on the ground and you think, oh, I'm just going to relax, yeah, you'll just flop, like the eagle, you'll just flop on your face, kind of metaphorically speaking, in terms of your concentration. But there comes a point, right, when the eagle is very high up, where if it were to continue making effort to flap higher, it would just go too high, right? It wouldn't do what eagles are supposed to do. At a certain point, right, it's supposed to glide. And so it's kind of like that. Does that make sense? So you have to know when to apply which instruction, and that's what Lama Tsongkhapa is partly implying here. So he's saying, as long as you have subtle excitement and subtle laxity, you have to make effort through introspection to identify them and overcome them. And then he says, actually, I'll just read this quote. He says, therefore summon your mind from its wandering and excitement so that it is tied to the object within, right? That means tied to your meditation object, right? That's the mindfulness that ties it, right? He says, and seek the stability factor, right? So create a stability in your mindfulness. He says, whenever the stability factor has arisen, beware of laxity and bring forth intense clarity, right? So at first you have to use mindfulness to tie your mind to the object and create stability. Once you've created stability, then there's the danger of laxity, mainly, right? That's where then laxity becomes an important obstacle. And he says, and the way to overcome, at that point, the way to overcome laxity is by intensifying the clarity of the meditation. He says you should accomplish faultless meditative stabilization by alternating between these two. Do not trust mere limpidity that lacks the factor of clarity together with the intensity of the mode of apprehension. Right? So you get that point? He's just emphasizing this point that it's not, also he's saying that sometimes people, I've said this before, kind of plateau, they develop a meditative stabilization where they no longer lose the object, right? But there's not clarity. And they just sort of stay there because it's relaxing, and he's saying that's not correct. You have to overcome that laxity through this kind of clarity, and how does he call it? Intensity of the mode of apprehension. But you can get the feeling there's a kind of, there's an energy, there's a clarity, there's a, what was like an aliveness, or a vividness, or to meditation that overcomes laxity. And again, one has to find without becoming excited. Does that make sense? Without exciting the mind. So the mind's still calm, but has this intensity and clarity. And that's a goal, is what he's describing. That's what he's describing. And then he says, now we're getting to this point where he says, when even subtle laxity and excitement have been cut off, right? So there's gross laxity, and there's sometimes they start middling, and then there's subtle laxity and excitement. So he says, when even the subtle ones have been cut off, as explained earlier, and the mind enters into equanimity without imbalances of becoming either lax or excited through the meditation, at that time it would be a mistake for your meditative stabilization if you applied antidotes or endeavored. So you should cultivate equanimity as an antidote to that. And he says that that's the point where you loosen up. Below he says that. That is to say, loosen the endeavor rather than letting go of the intensity of the mode of apprehension. So what he's saying here, right, is once you've reached the level of meditation, like the ego, right, going up, that level, he's defining where do you loosen up? Where do you let go? Where do you stop making effort? And he's saying you do that when you've overcome the tendencies towards subtle laxity and excitement. And he makes a point, at that point, if you were to continue making effort, it would become a distraction. Does that make sense? So when you've reached that level of experience, then you have to cultivate what he's calling equanimity here. And then he says, therefore this cultivation of equanimity is not performed whenever laxity and excitement do occur, but from the time you are past the peak of laxity and excitement. Because as long as you have not passed the peak for laxity and excitement, there is no equanimity. So actually, I'll just share this. Like when I read that, I was like, okay, where's the peak of where's the peak of laxity and excitement? So I was looking at different commentaries. I was like, what's the point where you reach the peak of those? And so I found the answer. I'll tell you. We'll get to that in a few pages. It's not. He doesn't really say it clearly in this text, I don't think. But there's a commentary that explains. Well, it's when you enter the 9th level of abiding, basically, which we'll get to. 9th level of concentration out of the 9. But so he's saying at that point you cultivate equanimity. And then he makes an interesting point here. He says this word equanimity has different meanings in Buddhism. And he identifies 3. He says there are 3 types of equanimity. And he's clarifying what does it mean, equanimity, right? He's saying cultivate equanimity at that point where you no longer have subtle laxity. And so he's saying one type, he's saying there are 2 types, there are 3 types. The first 2 are not what he's talking about here, but he wants to clarify that. So the first of the 3 types is what he calls equanimity of feeling. So that's where, like in mind and mental factors in Buddhist psychology, there are 3, like one of the, it's called an omnipresent mental factor. So there's always this, it's something that's always there in our experience, is there's always a quality of feeling that's either, it can be gross or subtle, but it's like a sense of either pleasure, displeasure, or neutral. And so we either like, dislike, or feel neutral about things. And so the first type of equanimity is that equanimity of feeling, where you don't feel like pleasure and attraction to something, or you don't feel displeasure and therefore aversion to something, but you just feel neutral. There's like a neutral feeling. And we apply that. Remember in the meditation on friends, enemies, and strangers, like that equanimity is with the one with like it's an equanimity where you don't care, like you don't feel any. So it's not a achievement. It's a normal state of mind, right? Like so, there are people we're attracted to and people we're averse to, and then people we sort of feel indifferent towards. So this equanimity is like that indifference. Or you could like feel, oh, there's a tree. That tree's so beautiful, or you think, oh, that's an ugly tree, and I'm worried it's going to fall in my house, or you could just not notice. You're sort of vaguely aware. And this is the one that's equanimous. So you don't have pleasure or pain or negative. So he's saying it's not that kind of equanimity. That's always there. Then he's saying there's a second kind of equanimity, which is immeasurable equanimity, right? And that's of the 4 immeasurables, right? There's love, compassion, equanimity, and joy, right? So that's like a cultivated state of immeasurable equanimity towards all sentient beings, right? Which is different than the first kind. That's a sense of what's the word? Actually, there are 2 different types of that, even also, aren't there? One is sometimes you meditate wishing that for others, wishing that others could achieve equanimity. But also there's a type where you meditate on for yourself, right? Where you recognize, for example, all beings are equal in wanting happiness and not wanting suffering. And so I shouldn't, what's the word? Promote those close to me and put down those far from me. But I should recognize that everybody's equal in that sense. That's a kind of equanimity, right? And then also the recognition that friends, enemies, and strangers are not permanent categories. And so one kind of calms one's mind and makes it even, in the sense of not getting overly excited about somebody who does something nice for you and not getting overly negative about people who are doing something unpleasant to you. And so you cultivate a kind of even-mindedness. And he's saying that is actually a meditative, that's a practice. And he's saying, but that's not what we're talking about here either. This is not this equanimity. And he's saying this equanimity is the equanimity of application. And he quotes Asanga's Shravaka levels, where it says, it is a mind resting even and at ease. Right? And so it's that kind of equanimity, right? It's a beautiful description, isn't it? That this kind of equanimity is the mind resting even and at ease upon its object from the class of calm abiding or special insight, operating naturally and achieving serviceability. Does that make sense? So it's a different kind. So this is a specific kind of equanimity in the context of meditative concentration, right? Where you're no longer making effort and the mind naturally rests at ease, effortlessly. And so it's a kind of equanimity also where you let go of effort. And so, and there he's saying, you can only do this kind of equanimity when you're at the level where even subtle lacks in excitement don't arise, so you don't have to make effort to overcome them. And at that point, you can rest at ease in natural meditation. And remember how I was saying, so Lama Tsongkhapa is weaving to, now we're getting to a next section. I was saying, I'll say this, like, one really, it takes some thought to sort of, he goes very deeply into these different instructions from different texts. So here, next, he's going to borrow a teaching on what are called the 5 faults and 8 antidotes in the process of cultivating meditative concentration, which he says here, he takes from Maitreya's separation of the middle from the extremes. Then on the next page, he's going to do the 9 levels of meditative concentration. He's going to teach on that, which comes from a different text, the Ornament of Mahayana Sutras, also by Maitreya, and is also taught in the Stages of Meditation by Kamalashila, and in the Instructions on the Perfection of Wisdom, and also and mainly from the Ornament of Mahayana Sutras. So he's weaving together these different streams of instruction to explain how you develop calm abiding. And if you really contemplate deeply, he does it in a fairly beautiful way. But here he begins by this section by quoting 3.5 verses from Maitreya's Separation of the Middle and Extremes, which lists the 5 faults and the 8 antidotes to developing calm abiding. And I think, so he says, on that basis, the serviceability of one's mind achieves all goals. It springs from the causes relied upon. The 8 factors removing 5 faults. So 8 antidotes, is what it's called. And then he lists them: laziness, forgetfulness of the instructions, excitement and laxity, non-application and application. These are asserted to be the 5 faults. The basis and what is based on it, the cause and effect of it, not forgetting the object observed, realizing excitement and laxity, application of removing them, and resting naturally when they are calm. So there Maitreya, this is typical if you study a little bit the text of Maitreya, you get the sense, Maitreya, actually, remember the story? Asanga, right, the great Buddhist master Asanga, he wanted to revitalize Buddhism in India, and so he did 12 years of retreat, right, and then he had a vision of Maitreya, and Maitreya took him to his Pure Land, Tushita, Pure Land, and taught him the 5 treatises. And so, in a sense, these 5 treatises actually were taught in a Pure Land, in a God realm. It's a Pure Land within a God realm, if that makes sense. And Asanga went there with Maitreya and heard these 5 treatises. And you can tell if you read them, or like this verse, that it's for somebody of very high faculties, right? He just says, he lists them. And the idea is that would dawn to your mind the meaning. Of course, for us, it may not be so easy. If I just read that, I'm not sure I know what the 5, I'm not sure I could understand the 5 faults. I'm sure I couldn't understand the 5, But they say for somebody of high faculties, they immediately, they understand what that means and they can practice it. For us, we might need more explanation. And so Lama Tsongkhapa gives some more explanation. But I'll go through them briefly. First, the five faults. So the first fault is laziness. Right? And actually, this is very practical, really. Like, in other words, in other words, if you're saying, well, it'd be nice to develop calm abiding, but then you're too lazy to sit and meditate, you're not going to develop calm abiding. So it's like, you can see how that would be an obstacle, right? Actually, I'll go through the five, and then I'll go back through them with the antidotes to each. Then, if you start to overcome laziness, so you actually sit down and try to meditate, forgetting the observed object, like forgetting your object of meditation or the instructions, of course, becomes the obstacle, right? So at the beginning, I mean, actually, if you have laziness, you're not going to begin really to make much effort. But once you start trying, forgetfulness, and by forgetfulness here doesn't mean like I forgot. It's not the normal like sense of like this in this context. It's not referring to like I forgot somebody's name, or it's like about when you're sitting down and meditating, forgetting what you're supposed to be doing, forgetting like if you're meditating on the image of a Buddha, for example, if you forget that and drift off to thinking about some other topic, you forgot. That's the forgetfulness here. And then it's interesting, right? So once you've gotten pretty good at overcoming laziness and forgetfulness, you keep the object. Right? At that point, the main obstacles are laxity and excitement. Does that make sense? That's where laxity and excitement become really relevant. When you're lazy and not meditating, laxity and excitement, while they're present, are kind of irrelevant. And even when you're forgetting the object, I mean, laxity and excitement could be somewhat relevant, but they're not that relevant because you don't yet have the mindfulness holding the object where you can be lax and you're holding up the object. Does that make sense? Like it's like you can't hold something too loosely if you're not holding it at all. So laxity and excitement become important faults as you progress. Actually, there's interesting. There, in a way, there is sign when you start to be able to address those. That's a sign of progress. And then once you've noticed laxity or excitement, the obstacle is not applying antidotes to overcome them. Right? Like if you just leave them there, your meditation will progress. So the fourth of the five faults would be failing to apply an antidote when you notice your mind is too excited or too lax. And then the fifth fault would be still applying the antidotes when you don't need to, right? So when you've reached that level that we were describing where you no longer have lasting excitement, if you were still like worrying about them and sort of having part of your mind looking for them and then trying to apply some antidote when they're not there, it'd be like the ego continuing to flap when it's already, above the mountain. At that point, the correct thing is to loosen up and stop making effort and just abide its natural state. So the fifth fault would be, and you see how each fault, like they're sequential in the sense that, if you were to start by, like, if before you overcame laziness, you thought, well, I'm just going to rest naturally and at ease and not make effort, that would just reinforce your laziness. That wouldn't be the correct. So these faults come up in order. Does that make sense? Like, so, and and you have to overcome them in this order. So those are the five faults of meditation. And then the 8 antidotes are how you overcome the 5 faults. Does that make sense? That's the way Maitreya is teaching. This is sort of Maitreya's structure of this particular teaching. So how do you so I'm going to go back now through them and just describe what the antidote is to each, or antidotes in some cases, in one case. So first of all, as we said, laziness mainly arises prior to successful meditative stabilization, right? So it could apply when you're not in, and we'll get into this in the 9 levels, that laziness is mainly at the first 2 levels and before them. Right? If you ever get to the first level because you're that lazy, then of course that's still laziness. So laziness is the one where he presents 4 antidotes. And I'll go over these in more detail later, so I won't go too deeply, but the first one is, he calls it firm faith. And I've said this kind of thing before, but I'll just remind you, like in this context, faith isn't like, let's see this right. Like when Khen's Rinpoche was explaining the meaning of, there are 3 kinds, and we'll get into that, but in brief, like faith is, it's not like, oftentimes in English the word faith, we sort of mean like, what people talk about, like faith in God, or faith in heaven, or faith in this context, it's not like that. Khen's Rinpoche said, it's more like, let me say it right. It's like, this whole process actually is like, so faith in this sense is a belief that something will help you, right? And so like people have, like, and Ken Shamshay gave the example, he said that when people go to the store to buy something. Confidence, it could be a way to say it. Like people have a confidence or a faith that it's worth buying the thing, right? Like so, whereas if somebody says, oh, I need a new car, right? And then they decide, somebody might like Honda or Toyotas or Ford or something, right? Like they have some faith, oh, that's a good product, right? Or like somebody wants a new phone, right? And they have an idea, oh, I like this kind of phone. And so it's a faith based on like, and why do people think that, right? Well, first of all, maybe they had some experience, other people told them, they saw the object or something, right? Like there's some, a person like based on some kind of investigation, if they're really good, they like read Consumer Reports maybe and other reviews, and they looked online and sort of researched the topic, and they come to some conclusion, I want this. Does that make sense? Because I think it's the best for me, for my needs. And so the point is like, faith is like that. It's not like a random or a leap of faith. It's like sort of based on some kind of process of researching about something, you develop some confidence and belief that this will help. And so overcoming laziness, the first step is developing faith that meditative concentration or calm abiding would help you. Does that make sense? Otherwise, why would you bother overcoming your laziness? But as you start to develop some kind of understanding and view, wow, this would really be amazing for me. I would like progress, and I would be happier, I would benefit others more, it would help me progress on the path, I could gain all kinds of both, actually, if you study it, like, there are all kinds of things that come. Including like happiness, like an incredible, like a peace of mind. Actually, they say, like, for example, meditative concentration leads to a state of peace of mind, of what they call pliancy, a kind of flexibility and lightness, and bliss that are more intense than anything we've ever experienced, somebody who doesn't have calm abiding has ever experienced. Right? So one might look and go, wow, that sounds pretty good. And then like there are all these descriptions of realizations a person can have, whether they be like super mundane realizations or like realizing emptiness, right? Actually gaining special insight into emptiness. And then there are like mundane ones, like miraculous powers and clairvoyance and all kinds of mundane achievements or something that come with calm abiding. And so if a person like was studying those topics and sort of met people who had progressed in the process of calm abiding, they might develop a kind of enthusiasm or interest or trust or faith or confidence. I want to achieve that. And from faith comes aspiration. Does that make sense? And that's like, again, this is not something mystical particularly, right? Like, it's like where the person thinks, using that mundane example, the person thinks, oh, this is the kind of phone I want. And then they develop the aspiration, meaning like, wow, I kind of want to go to the store and get that. Right? Like, when can I fit that into my schedule? And how will I get there? And what store should I go to? Like that's aspiration, where you're starting to sort of want to go. So with meditative concentration, the first step is like developing some interest in it and trust. Then there's like, oh, it sounds like valuable enough that I actually want to try to achieve it. How could I do that? Could I set things up? Could I meditate more? Could I create time in my schedule? Or could I set time aside for retreat and so on, right? That's aspiration. Does that make sense? And that leads to joyous effort. And joyous effort is the third of the 8 antidotes. And joyous effort is where the person's actually endeavoring, right? Like, if it were the mundane thing, it'd be like they're going to the store and they're purchasing the thing. With meditative concentration, it's where the person is no longer just sort of based on their faith and based on their aspiration, they're actually practicing. Does that make sense? And that's really overcoming laziness. And notice it's joyous effort, right? It's not just effort. Right? It's taking joy in the process, because if you don't, you won't continue doing it. Also, joyous effort is better than just effort, isn't it? It's more fun. And it's more sustainable, right? It's one of the 6 perfections, actually, isn't it? And finally, the fourth of those antidotes, the first 4, right, apply to laziness. So the fourth one of these is, and they combine 2 together, it's bliss and pliancy. And pliancy is like a kind of lightness and flexibility of body and mind. And so what they say is, when somebody's achieved calm abiding, they achieve these 2 things, a bliss of body and mind, and a pliancy, a lightness and flexibility of body and mind. And when one has achieved that, there is no longer laziness. Laziness is completely eliminated. That person has suppressed their capacity to feel lazy. Actually, they don't have any laziness at all. So those are the 4 antidotes to laziness. And then the antidotes to the others is pretty straightforward. You could say, what's the antidote to forgetting? Right, forgetting the object of meditation, to not forget. Yeah, which is mindfulness. Actually, really, it's mindfulness, right? Like, and actually, because one of the qualities of mindfulness is not being mindless, right? It means not sort of drifting away and just letting the mind go anywhere, but keeping awareness of the object of meditation. So mindfulness is the antidote to, because remember, forgetting in this sense, as I said, is not forgetting somebody's name or forgetting your phone number, or forgetting a phone number or something of somebody. It's not forgetting what you're trying to be aware of, right? In this case, whatever you're meditating on. So remaining mindful of that would be the antidote to that. Then the antidote to laxity and excitement is introspection, right, which we've been talking about. Right? And in this case, introspection introspection has that specific meaning of being aware, like noticing your own mind and being aware of obstacles to your meditation, and particularly any laxity or excitement. The antidote to not applying the antidotes would be applying the antidotes, of course. Once you use, which is based on introspection. Though you can't apply the antidotes if you're not being introspective, right? So you have to introspect, be aware of an antidote, and then apply the antidote. And then the 5th of the 5 faults, right, was over-application, or still trying to apply introspection and effort when you're already are free from laxity and excitement. And the antidote to that, which Lama Tsongkhapa just said, was equanimity, right? Or you could say resting evenly, resting naturally. A kind of equanimity of no longer making effort, but resting naturally and spontaneously in meditation at that point. So does that make sense, how the 5 faults and the 8 antidotes are fit together? Right? Each antidote applies to a certain fault of meditation. And here, the next paragraph, I'm just pausing. Lama Tsongkhapa is kind of explaining what we were just talking about. And he's saying things like, when there is laxing excitement, you have to make effort to overcome them. When there is no laxing excitement, you have to stop making effort at that point, at that level, and so on. And he's talking about, how do you, that you apply those in order. Does that make sense? And that because the faults come in order, to some extent, the antidotes have to come, in that order. And then he says something else which is important. He says, I'll just read this paragraph. He says, this freeing of the single-pointed meditative stabilization of the mind from laxity and excitement by means of mindfulness and introspection is common to all instructions on how to practice. Therefore, you should not hold it to be a specific detail of the, we're calling it the vehicle of characteristics. Like you shouldn't think, what he's saying here is this, and he's saying it's even taught in Highest Yoga Tantra. What he's saying here is this, is this process of developing calm abiding and meditative concentration, it can, I'll put it this way, it can sound, because there's lists, right? 5 faults and 8 antidotes, and we're getting into 9 levels and so on. It could sound as though, actually it's an important point, it could sound as though it's like intellectual or something, like an intellectualized presentation, or some sort of, like, metaphysical discussion or something like that. And what he's saying is, that's not the case, right? Like, whereas what he's saying is, say it the right way, like, this is a description of how you develop meditative concentration, and whether you're practicing, visualizing, focusing on your breath, or if you're doing Highest Yoga Tantra practices and you're visualizing deities and mandalas and syllables and so on, the process is the same, right? And if you're practicing Mahamudra, meditating on the nature of mind, or you're meditating on, so whether your object of meditation is the nature of your own mind, or is deities, or is syllables, or is an image of the Buddha, or is your breath, or is, any of the different objects he was saying, if you're going to develop calm abiding, the process of progressing is the same. It's not like there's some other way to develop meditative concentration. one has to overcome these same obstacles, right? If you're having, and like whichever object of meditation, or whichever sort of system of, whatever, again, whether it's a tantric system or some other thing, doesn't matter. If there's mental laxity, you're not going to develop calm abiding. Does that make sense? Like, if there's mental excitement, you're not going to develop calm abiding. So you have to overcome them regardless. Like, it's the nature of your own psychology. Whereas it's like you can't get away from yourself, right? If you haven't overcome those things, you're not going to have concentration. If you do overcome them, your concentration will improve. And so he's saying, don't think that this is just a philosophical discussion. And one more point that he's implying there, to say, is like, actually, like, say it this way, like, it could seem like detailed, right? Because it is detailed. But that's because it's not easy to develop meditative concentration. Like, I mean, especially calm abiding is a difficult thing to achieve. And the Dalai Lama, in his commentary of this, was saying, like, sometimes people would come to him after doing some retreat, and they would say, well, I only achieved, like, there are 9 levels we're about to get to. And the person would say, I have only achieved the 6th level after, like, doing some retreat or something. And the Dalai Lama would say, well, that's because it's not, like, that's because it's hard. What do you expect? Like, this is not an easy. And it's also like, we often talk, I often say, I mean, other people have said this, and I think it's reasonable, it is a good way to describe it, is that a lot of these things are like inner technologies. Does that make sense? And, like this process of developing calm abiding, it's not, first of all, it's not uniquely Buddhist, right? Like, there's other systems, other traditions have described the same process. It's something psychological, it's something achievable. Alan Wallace, a Buddhist scholar and practitioner, has done some project of, like, actually teaching people these instructions and then doing scientific studies, like seeing how they progress as they do retreats actually with him, and then without him, he teaches them and they go off and do retreat. But he does like questionnaires and different physiological tests showing how people progress. So this is not something, like, it's a predictable, repeatable process that can be studied and that can be repeated in different cultures. It's not dependent on culture, it's not dependent on being Buddhist, right? It's something about how you develop concentration. It's actually funny, many years ago I was reading the American psychologist, William James. I just thought this was funny. In a book he wrote, he said something like, it just occurred to him, right, because he was interested in the mind, where he said, oh, people can't concentrate. Like, he said, if you try to concentrate on something, like, after just a few moments, your mind will jump away. He said, so it's not possible to stay on one. And I thought it was funny, because his experiment was, he tried it a couple times. It's like he brought something to mind and tried it, like, 2 or 3 times, and thought, oh, my mind jumped away, I guess it's not possible. Which was, I guess, the beginning of an inquiry, but he didn't really take it beyond that point. Whereas actually Buddhist and Hindu and other teachers have gone deeper than that in their experimentation with concentration. And so anyway, so the point is that you need, if you really want to cultivate meditative concentration, then all these details and instructions are very helpful, because there's not, like, there's not some external sign, right? In other words, you need something to compare your own experience to go, oh, where am I at? And what do I do next? Does that make sense? And, like, nobody else, like, you can't, it's not like, you could look at somebody's hand and tell this, or their ear or something, like, right? It's only by looking in your own mind that you can tell this. So you need instructions like this that are detailed, especially if you're doing the practice. And actually, I think all these details become extremely useful to that person, right? If you're trying to progress, and then you can see, how am I doing, and what do I do next, and where's my obstacle, and so on. And that's going to become much more true as we go through now the 9 levels. So now that's the next section. So Lama Tsongkhapa just presented the 5 faults and the 8 antidotes. Now he's going to get into the 9 levels, which he's taking, he says, from various sources, including mainly Maitreya's Ornament of Mahayana Sutras, but also Kamalashila stages of meditation. And yeah, okay, so we'll go, and I'll explain, like, what I want to do actually is, I'll read what he says, but then I want to kind of, I'll try to explain what it means, because he does it fairly briefly at points here. But so, and this actually, you'll see, you can check for your, this is very useful in this sense. You can actually check for yourself then, what level am I at? Does that make sense? In your own practice. You can check for yourself, like, because it's describing what happens. And these are, again, like predictable processes that a person goes through as they're developing their concentration. So the first of the 9 levels of quiescence, they calls it stages of quiescence that arise, right? 9 stages, 9 levels of quiescence, meaning what? Calm abiding, right? So, of sort of, but they're not yet calm abiding. So you could say 9 levels of meditation that arise on the path, on the way to calm abiding. That's the way to put it. So the first one is called placement. And first I'll read what Lama Tsongkhapa actually says. He says, placing the mind on such and such consists in collecting the mind from all external objects and directing it towards an object within, having directed the mind towards the object. Right? And so now I want to describe in more detail what this is saying, right? So that when you start practicing meditation, right, concentration meditation, placement is the first stage. And what Lama Tsongkhapa here is describing is, first of all, the process is collecting, he says it's collecting the mind in from all external objects and trying to stabilize it on some object. Right? And we've all tried this, right? If you meditate on your breath, you're trying to do that, right? So you're collecting your mind away from other thoughts and other visual stimuli, auditory stimuli, and you're trying to place it within an object, right? Focusing it on an object, but in this case, let's say the breath, and to stabilize it there. And so the mind absorbs away from other things. Does that make sense? Like you're trying to sort of take them. And when Khenchen Rinpoche explained this, he was saying there's he was making a point actually, and it's in the Easy Path, where he says, you know, anytime you're doing something, sometimes when you're doing bad things, but anytime you're doing something good, there's a certain level of concentration. Does that make sense? And so he's saying, so what's the difference here? Like, how is this different from ordinary concentration? Like, you know, so for example, like, and he gave the example of if you're watching a movie that's like really great, your mind sort of, you forget about everything else, right? And your mind is just focused on that movie. Or if you really like music and you're listening to a beautiful piece of music, your mind sort of completely focuses on the music and everything else sort of falls away. And so you make a point, it's like that. Does that make sense? There's this experience at this level of other things starting to fall away and of sort of absorbing. That's what we say, like being absorbed in. Does that make sense? In whatever you're focusing on. But at this level, placement, they say, I'll read it, discursive thoughts are like a waterfall. So in other words, there's no stopping of your discursive thoughts at this level, or very little, right? They're almost always, like there's almost a continuous flow of other thoughts going on. So you're trying to focus on an image of the Buddha or your breath, and thoughts are extremely active, and subjectively it could feel like you're thinking more than you were before. You're having more distracting thoughts. And they often say that's not true, it's just you didn't notice them. Until you tried to concentrate on something, you didn't notice that you were having a continuous stream of discursive thoughts. But at this level of placement, you're aware, you start to notice, wow, I'm continually sort of distractible, I have all these thoughts going on, I have all these emotions, I have all this stuff happening, and you start to have this experience of kind of, as you're trying to concentrate, of sort of temporarily getting absorbed in the object for brief periods. Lama Tsongkhapa on the next page says, this level of concentration called placement arises just through the power of listening to the instructions and somebody else. Like in other words, you've heard the instruction, you're trying it out. So like, so this would be like, you know, like it could be, you know, like you go to a weekend retreat, for example, and somebody's explaining it, and they're guiding you through meditations, and they say, okay, now try it a little bit. And over the course of a weekend, you'll start to have this kind of experience. Or if you did a week-long retreat or something, you would start to have this experience where you'd have moments of being absorbed, but you'd also be noticing, wow, my mind is just like, what do they call it, like a monkey mind, right? That's what some say. Like my mind is like a monkey, it's jumping everywhere. And Khenchen Rinpoche said, this is not in Lama Tsongkhapa's text, but Khenchen Rinpoche in his commentary on this said, at this level of concentration, you sometimes have the experience of just for like the length of a few breaths that you can concentrate. And when you fully achieve this level of placement, you can hold your mind on an object for as long as it would take to take 21 breaths. Beyond, you can't really hold your mind longer than that. And there are still thoughts going on in the background while you're doing that. Does that make sense? But you can hold the mind for somewhere between a few breaths and up to about 21 breaths, that long, on whatever you're meditating on. And there's some experience of absorption, like of sort of things falling away. Again, which is not mystical, it's like what you have when you listen to a great piece of music, or when you're, if you're in nature, if you were out, like if you've had this experience everyone's like once I was out in the woods and suddenly I saw, like I was sitting there and suddenly I saw a bear. There's like a moment of like real concentration. It's not meditative concentration, but it's a moment of like, other things fall away and you're really focused, because I didn't expect to see it was like walking by. But I'm just giving you different examples, right? The same thing if you're watching a movie. There's this experience of like other stuff falling away and you really kind of concentrate more deeply, but it's not free of discursive thoughts. It's not, and it's not terribly long. Right, so this level, again though, this level arises through listening, through study, and through a little bit of practice. And it really is, that level, right, is achievable in a weekend. You can start to have a couple breaths worth of concentration. That's realistic, I think. Then the second level is called continuous placement. And one point is this arises not just through the force of hearing somebody else's instructions, but through thinking deeply. And that's important, because this level, actually, like we say there are three, some of you have heard this before, there are three kinds of wisdom. There's the wisdom of listening, arisen through listening. There's the wisdom arisen through your own contemplation. And then there's the wisdom of meditation. The first one, placement, really just arises through the power of listening. This one, continuous placement, arises through the power of contemplation. In other words, so you've now thought about the instructions, and you've thought about meditation enough that you're kind of going on the force of your own understanding now, not just on, like, the other one, the first one is like, people, all the time that happens, right? Somebody like listens to a podcast about meditation, and they maybe play podcasts, and they play guided meditations or something, and they can achieve a level of placement. Continuous placement, you've gone beyond that. In other words, you've thought about the instructions, you've thought about meditation enough, and then while you're meditating, this is important also, it's not yet deep meditation. You're thinking, oh wait, I'm watching my breath. Oh, I'm on the out breath. Oh, okay. Like, your thoughts are still guiding the process mainly, so it's still a very discursive process at this point. But it's arisen through through the wisdom of contemplating. From the third level on, they're all arisen through the power of meditation, the wisdom of meditation. That's where the actual wisdom of meditation begins, is at the third level. So here it's still mainly a discursive, contemplative process. Lama Tsongkhapa about placement says, the directed mind is continually placed on the object over a period of time without being distracted to anything else. Continuously don't let it get distracted. And so here, a few things. One is, they're slightly long, like there's less interruption, so you start to have less forgetting of the object, whatever. Let's say let's just use the breath as an example. So you start to have longer stretches where you're actually able to keep the mind on the breath. And there are some periods of sustained focus on the breath that are longer than 21 breaths, for example. At this level, sometimes discursive thoughts are quite present, so they've definitely not subsided. But you start to have sort of like moments or brief periods where it feels like they're tired out, like your discursive thinking sort of takes a break. Does that make sense? The breaks aren't terribly long, but there's sort of these experiences where as you're focusing on whatever you're focusing on, there's these periods where before it was like a waterfall, whereas here it's like there's still plenty of discursive thinking, but there are moments or sometimes brief periods where it feels like they've kind of calmed down, then they come back. Then they calm down, then they come back. Then they calm down, then they come back. At this level, there's lots of laxity and lots of excitement still. So there is even gross levels of laxity. Excitement are almost always present. So the mind is like, if you think of it like, there was a metaphor before of like an elephant tied to a rope, right? At the first level, tied to a tree or something. at the first level it was barely connected, right? It would stay for sure. Here, it's like continually pulling at the, like it's bumping into the tree, it's pulling away, and then the rope pulls it back. So the mindfulness is trying to hold it to the object, but it's not easy to hold the mind to the object. And only every now and then do your discursive thoughts stop. But even when they stop, there's laxity there, there's excitement there, and so on. Kensher Rinpoche in his commentary said, at this level though, you can stay with the object. He was giving like an example of length of time. So the first one was like from 2 or 3 breaths up to about 21 breaths. So like a rough description. Right? And then Kensher Rinpoche said, at this level, you can keep your mind on whatever your object is, whether it be a visualized Buddha or the breath, for about the time it would take. He gave this analogy, it's a very Tibetan one. If you think of a mala, right, like a rosary with 108 beads, he's saying, like Tibetans often will say, Om Mani Padme, Om Mani Padme, Om Mani Padme, Om Mani, which is the mantra of the Buddha of compassion. And he says, if you think of how long it takes to go once, saying Om Mani Padme Hung around a full mala, he says about that long you can stay with the object. That was like a traditional Tibetan description of how long. Of course, it depends how fast you say mantras or something. So they're not being. They're giving a general sense. That's the point. And I think he said that description came from Pabonka Rinpoche that he was describing it about. And then Kensher Rinpoche made another point which I thought was interesting, which is some people don't describe it this way, but he quoted a number of different scholars who say this, that at the second level, continuous placement, which again is not. This level is not so difficult to achieve, right? You can imagine where somebody could focus on their breath for the length of time it takes to recite a mala. And there's still plenty of discursive thoughts, but you start to have breaks. I think actually people who do I think it's very common actually for people who do, say, a week-long retreat to easily achieve the second, maybe the third or something. But the point Kensher Rinpoche was making is he said, at this point you begin to have little, not very powerful experiences, but sort of some beginning of experience of bliss and of lightness, or pliancy. And what he was saying was, these scholars who say this idea, what they say is that this idea of the pleasure, we call it, like pleasure of meditation and a kind of physical well-being that comes from meditation, start to be experienced at this level. And then that will continue to become more intense as you go through the rest of the levels. And at the level of calm abiding, it becomes an overwhelming experience. And so part of the point there, though, is that as you progress, you start to have these experiences of the pleasure of meditation, both a kind of physical and mental sense of pleasure, that also encourage you to keep practicing. So actually, I sometimes think that people who, once you get to these levels, the second, the third, that pleasure of meditation is what helps a person want to keep meditating. And if somebody doesn't get to that point, that's where it's easier to stop meditating. It's not working. They're not getting much. The people say, "I'm not getting much out of it," or something like that. Because people people continue to do things that they enjoy, right? And then I think I'm going to do a little bit of this. So I want to say something else too, which is, if you really want to understand this topic well, Lama Tsongkhapa is presenting it quite clearly. Kensher Rinpoche, as I'm describing, is making some additional points from the Easy Path. And there's a wonderful book called Calm Abiding and Special Insight by Geshe Gendon Lodo, where he covers it quite in detail. So I would recommend you can interweave these. And one thing he does, which I appreciate, is he integrates the teaching on the 5 faults and the 8 antidotes into the 9 levels. Does that make sense? We just covered the 5 faults and the 8 antidotes. He describes at what point in the 9 levels does each of those become most relevant. So it's a nice description. Lama Tsongkhapa is assuming that you'll figure that out. That's why he presents them next to each other. Geshe Gendon Lodo is sort of saying, in case it's not clear, let me tell you how they integrate together. And so one point he's making is, and Lama Tsongkhapa does some of that on the next page also, but okay, so what he's saying is this, is at the first 2 levels, placement and continuous placement, the main obstacles are laziness and forgetting. Make sense? Because there's the early phases, right? And so that's where then he goes into, so how do you overcome laziness? You overcome it as we described, right, through developing, and then he actually goes through, I won't go into all the detail, but Geshe again and Lodo in this text and other texts do the same thing. They describe kind of different kinds of faith. So there's like the faith of conviction, the faith of clarity about a topic. Basically what it means though is that, basically the idea here though is this, is that if to develop placement and continuous placement, you have to develop some, what's the word? Some idea that there's a benefit to practicing meditation, or you won't do it, right? And so you have to think about, well, what are the benefits, and why would I do that? And you actually contemplate. To overcome laziness, you actually think, well, why would I want to meditate? What's the point? What's the reason for doing that? And you sort of think about what are the advantages to it, and so on. And as you think about those, you first develop a kind of confidence that there's a benefit. Then you develop an aspiration where I want to do that. And then eventually you develop exertion or joyous effort or, endeavor, where you start actually doing it. But you don't stop thinking about the benefits at this level because you still have the tendency towards laziness. Does that make sense? And so you practice those antidotes to laziness. But the other one is forgetfulness, right? At this level, the first two levels, you're still often forgetting the object of meditation itself. You're forgetting what you're doing. Like you forget to, you drift away and you don't even catch yourself sometimes and so on. And so at these two levels, you also have to really focus on developing mindfulness, right? And you're strengthening your mindfulness so that you stay with the object, right? You're really developing this ability to be mindful of whatever you're trying to meditate on, your object of meditation. Okay, and then I'll do one more. I'll do the third level, and then I'll pause if there are questions. So the third level is, he calls it patchy placement. I like that phrase, patchy placement. And so here, the meditator, first I'll read Lama Tsongkhapa's quote. At this level, if you get a distraction due to forgetfulness, so that you are distracted to external things, you realize it and tie your mind to the object again. Realizing distraction quickly, you should patch it up again. That's why they call it patchy. It's always Lama's translator called it, instead of patchy, called it resetting. You get this idea. It's just getting at a feeling, right? You're sort of keep coming back. There's less distraction in the mind. I'll kind of go through the more detail. So at this point, first of all, there are longer periods of placement on the object, right? They're getting, before it was like a few breaths, then a mala is the word. Now it's getting longer that you can stay with your object of meditation at some point. At this level, you start to feel like you can concentrate pretty well. Like, subjectively, you have that feeling. And you, you do still get distracted away. At this level, you still sometimes lose the object. But you're able to, as the text said, you're able to bring it back quickly at this level. Does that make sense? Like before, sometimes, even at the second level, you would have these periods where you could focus, and then your mind would drift away, and like you'd have to come back, and then like it wasn't. There was still more forgetfulness. At this level, you're having less forgetfulness, and so at this level, when the mind drifts away, you bring it back right away. Does that make sense? Like, so if you're doing a half-hour session, for most of that half hour, you'd be on the object. Sometimes your mind still would drift away, but you'd be able to bring it back quickly when it does. A couple other points, I'll read these quotes. One was, Ken Rinpoche described it, he said, it's like in terms of the discursive thoughts, you still have them for sure, but he says it's like they're tired out at this point. Like they don't have, like before they were very like, what's the word? They were like a monkey jumping around. At this point they're tired. Like maybe, instead of like a monkey jumping around, they're like an old dog or something. They're there. They're not. Your discursive thoughts are still present, but they're not like a monkey jumping everywhere in the room. They're like a dog that sort of puts its head up. Sometimes it goes back down, and then might walk around you, and then lay back down, like that. And at this point, one of the commentaries said, like you still get distracted, but you don't fully lose your stream of concentration. Or so you're like if you're focusing on the breath, for example, right? You're focusing on the breath, your mind starts to drift away, and you bring it back. So it's not like you fully lose it. Does that make sense? You don't really drift away anymore, like to other topics where you catch yourself. Like oftentimes at the beginning when we're meditating, like you're focusing on, if it was the breath, right? You're focusing on the breath, and suddenly you're like, oh wow, for 3 minutes I've been thinking about work or my friend, or this person I'm upset with, or whatever. At this level, you do have distraction, but there's no 3 minute. It's like you catch it as the mind's starting to go and you bring it back. And this level is accomplished through the force of mindfulness. Does that make sense? So your mindfulness has gotten strong at this point. And really, it's like if we think of like the elephant tied to the tree metaphor, the rope is now very strong, and the elephant doesn't. It may pull away. It doesn't break away anymore. That's what. And again, it's at this level in terms of the 5 faults and 8 antidotes. It's mindfulness that's successfully starting to overcome forgetfulness at this level, or is successfully overcoming forgetfulness. And I'll just share one thing that. This is a side note, but it was interesting, so I'll just share it. Like this book, Geshe Gendan Lodo, he said something, he said a couple interesting points. He said, some meditators, when they get to this level, what happens is, now you're developing actual meditative concentration. Like you're starting to have a real experience of meditation. And he makes a point, he says, at this level, there's sometimes the experience, we all have certain habits of certain mental afflictions, and we're different. Some people have more desire, or anger, pride, or jealousy, or whatever our habitual patterns are. And he says, those are always there kind of under the surface. Remember, at the first level, you thought, wow, am I thinking more? There's all this discursive thoughts, right? It seems like it's continuous. It must be worse, but it was there under the surface all along, but you didn't notice it, and then you notice it. At this level, that happens with your mental affliction. So in other words, like, if you have always had a certain habituation to a certain mental, like, where it's, not always, but there's it's continuous, but where you have a habit of feeling a certain mental affliction a lot, or having a certain mental affliction a lot, at this level, it starts to be like, you start to really see it. In other words, and it could feel like, oh wow, why am I so jealous, or why am I so angry, or why am I so desirous? Well, you always were. Now you're really seeing that. Does that make sense? And he says, that's normal. Like at one point, I'm just sharing because like it was useful to see. If you didn't read that, you could think, well, what's going on? Am I losing my mind? Or is something wrong with me? And I've known a lot of people who have had that experience where they go and like, even like a 10-day. I've known people like that where they go into like a 10-day retreat or a 2-week retreat or a month retreat, and suddenly they're like, they'll describe this. They'll say, what's wrong with me? Like I had all these weird experiences and I was feeling like so much, whatever, some mental affliction, right? And then like. And either they think it's bad, or if the mental affliction's pride, they think it's great. Like, oh, I'm the bad. Like they got caught up in some thing like that, and they don't realize that it's this thing that's happening. Whatever the mental affliction was that was there under the surface is sort of suddenly being noticed more and seems worse because it's like the other things that usually, because actually, like, for example, if somebody's angry, right, in ordinary, actually, if somebody comes, sometimes you'll tell a person, like, you might say to somebody, well, distract yourself, like, go watch a movie or something. Like, if somebody's really angry, right, you might say, go take a walk, go watch a movie, go distract yourself. But at this level, distraction's falling away, right? So you no longer it's like you're intentionally taking away one of your coping mechanisms, and so your mental affliction is going to become more obvious, and you have to then apply an antidote. Does that make sense? You can't any longer use distraction as your. It's like that. It's like you're taking away one coping mechanism, and so now you have to do a deeper coping, right? Which is to actually uproot, to actually, what's the word? Confront, maybe is a way to say it, that mental affliction, and deal with it. And so Geshe Gendan Lodo says, if you've studied the teachings enough, then you know how to do that. And he says, if you haven't, he says, then go to your teacher and offer your realization. What he means is like, go to your teacher and say, I've made progress. And what that progress means is now I'm noticing how angry I am. And then your teacher can advise you, oh, well, here's what he. So he's saying if you know from your own study what to do at that point, like for example, the antidote to anger is love, right? So in other words, if a person reached that level and then they start noticing I'm very angry, well, they might do, first of all, actually, if you've studied Shantideva, right, there are a humongous number of techniques that Shantideva teaches for developing patience, that sort of that calm and soothe our anger and like put out the flame. So the Buddha said often meditate on love as an antidote to anger, but then Shantideva has probably, I find 30 different techniques in his. So if you were angry, you would apply those. Does that make sense? But if you don't know those, then you have to go ask your teacher, and they would say, oh, apply this antidote. Because he says, again, Lotus says, if you don't do that, you'll get stuck at the third level. Does that make sense? And from people I've also known, like, they sometimes just, like, what's the word? They reach the third level and they sort of like, they get caught up in some mental affliction and they give up on the process because it distracts them away into some other trip or thing or something like that. So it's important to know, so I just thought, even though Lama Tsongkhapa doesn't explicitly mention this, I thought to mention it there because that's quite important. And it's not uncommon, right? Because again, like, that can happen in, you can get temporarily to this third level if you do if you have a kind of disposition towards meditation and you do a slightly longer retreat, you can get to that level and that experience may come. And that's okay, it's not a bad thing. But then you have to, again, know, okay, I took away the coping mechanism of distraction, so the mental affliction that was already there is becoming clearer to me. This is the time to face that and work through that mental affliction, and then my meditation will continue to progress. And also if you're meditating, say, on the breath or an image of a Buddha, this is where Lama Tsongkhapa said earlier, he made a point, and this is where this would be relevant. He did address this earlier in the text, but he didn't say at the third level at that time. But one more point is this, if the mental affliction is very light, well, then it's not going to be a problem, right? You would just let it go and focus on your object and it would go away. But if it's stronger, at this point, you take a break. If your meditation were on the image of a Buddha, but your mental affliction, like I just said, let's say it was anger, right? You take a break temporarily from meditating on the Buddha and you meditate on those antidotes, on love or on the antidotes from Shantideva and so on, until you sort of directly deal with the mental affliction until you genuinely can sort of shift your own experience and it calms down. And then you go back to your original object. Does that make sense? You go back to the Buddha, or you go back to the breath, or you go back to whatever your object was. But if you stay with your object at this point, it's not going to work. So you have to take a break, address the mental affliction, and then come back, if it's powerful. So those are the first three, like, levels or experiences. Yeah, levels. They should call that levels, or what does he call it? Stages that one goes through in developing meditative concentration, progressing to calm body. Any questions about those before I go on to the fourth? It's an interesting topic, though, isn't it? And you really can. You see how you really can, like, there is nobody else. Like, you don't have to. Like, what's the word? Is right. You don't have to go to somebody else, right? Like, in other words, you can check from your own experience. Like, let's say if you went and did a weekend retreat, you could check for your own experience. All right, well, what level am I at? It's not mysterious at that point, and you can assess yourself. And you can see, okay, what's the obstacle, and am I progress? You see how it's useful. If you were at the second level, you can say, well, what's the how do I overcome that? Okay, laziness, and it's like quite useful, right? Well, the two things I have to address at this level mainly are laziness and lack of mindfulness, forgetfulness. So I have to apply mindfulness. I have to think about the benefits and why am I doing this. I have to be clear about my motivation. I have to sort of clarify, how much aspiration do I have? How interested am I, and so on. And are there things getting in the way of that, and so on. So you know what to address at least, in order to progress from the second to the third level, for example. And then strengthening your mindfulness, which requires joyful effort. Does that make sense? That's why it was a faith, aspiration, joyful effort, right? Because strengthening the mindfulness mainly comes with the joyful effort, right? That you're starting to get into the process of, really, like at this level, you're really energizing your own process of mindfulness. You're like, and it takes effort. It's not just like, it's like, okay, I'm going to really try to be mindful. This is like, you have kind of an enthusiasm for the practice, and you do short period, right? Relatively short sessions, and you're sort of energized at that point in making effort at mindfulness, and that's going to overcome the forgetfulness, and you're going to progress to the third level. All right, I'll keep going. So the fourth level then is close placement. That's what they call it. And first, like I've been doing, I'll read Lama Tsongkhapa's quote. I'll quote Lama Tsongkhapa first. Close placement is explained as follows in the instructions on the perfection of wisdom. And then he says, the mind, while extensive by nature, is collected again and again, and thus refined, so that placement gets better and better. This accords with the statement, quote, intelligent people should more and more collect their minds internally. And this is really, okay.
I want to hear what you're going to say.
Actually, so it's interesting, if you read that description, like, what is he getting at? He's getting an experience, right? That's what he's trying to describe. And when Khenpo Rinpoche described this, he said, the experience at this level, which is different than the level before, there are a number of like things that make the experience different. One is, the experience it's like the mind absorbs into the object. That's your experience at that. It starts to have more it starts to become more experientially more like your mind is absorbing into the object and all other things are falling away. Does that make sense? Like, I was describing earlier, like the sense of watching a movie. At this level, it's much more intense than that, right? The feeling subjectively is like, it's more, what he says, it's more refined. Is that the word he used? Yeah, more refined, right? So there's this feeling of subtlety and of absorption. And Khenpo Rinpoche said at this level, one thing is, if you want, you could make the object smaller. Like at the beginning, like if you were going to visualize a Buddha, you would experientially you would need the Buddha to sort of be at least life size or fairly big or like a statue. At this level, your mind starts to become refined, where if it feels like you could actually do it if you wanted. You could make the Buddha, like the size of a pea, and your mind could do it. Does that make sense? Your mind, like at the beginning, if you tried to do that, your mind would just, it would be too subtle, and you couldn't do it. At this level, if you wanted to shrink the object of meditation, you could, and you could still hold on, and your mind feels refined like that. And there's this quality of absorption, right, where it feels like your mind and the object are becoming non-dual, subjectively and experientially. At this level, there's almost no distraction. And also, there's another distinctive feature of this level, is from this point on, while you have a session, right, so if you set a session of 20 minutes or half hour or something, for that half hour, you don't lose the object. Like, in other words, like, so if you're meditating on an image of the Buddha, for that half hour, you don't forget the image of the Buddha. Like, that's the experience at that point. But at this level, you can still have quite intense laxity and quite intense excitement, right? So your mind, so you're able to hold the image of the Buddha for that half hour, but it might be dull at times. At times, you may still have excitement where the mind's trying to pull away to something else. But at this level, your mindfulness is strong enough that you don't actually let it pull away. Does that make sense? So you might have like a tendency towards distraction to another object through attachment, but your mindfulness is strong enough that you notice it and you don't let the mind go. And the same thing with laxity, right? At times it might be quite dull. There might be moments of clarity, but there are moments where it's not very clear. But you can still, at least the mindfulness is still there. Does that make sense? You don't lose the object. You don't forget the object. You don't drift away. And so Khenpo Rinpoche noted, so from level 4 on, the object is no longer lost. And the Dalai Lama said it, how did he put it, close belief, and he said, there's no or almost no distraction anymore. And you remember, like, at one point we said, well, I'll say it this way, like so, if you think about the 5 faults and the 8 antidotes, prior to this level, the main problems were laziness and forgetting, right? Not lack of mindfulness. At this level, those are no longer the main obstacles, right? Like, in other words, you're not forgetting anymore. And you have some energy for meditation already. So now, laxity and excitement become the main obstacles. This is where actually, and Geshe Genden Lodro makes a point, which other teachers also make. Laxity and excitement are issues before this, right? In other words, you can address them, and you can notice them and apply antidotes, but they're not the main obstacle, right? Because if you can't, I said earlier, like if you can't hold the object continually, if it's clear or not is not as important. Right? At this level, you can hold the object, and now you're having to, now those become more relevant. So it's not that they weren't there before, they were, and it's not that you couldn't address them before, you could, but now they become the main topic of your progress, or the main thing to address, and the main obstacle. And so remember, what's the way to, so now also, introspection becomes the most important antidote. And remember, I don't know, for those who were here, a couple classes ago I said, I quoted, I noted that strong introspection, it said Lama Tsongkhapa was asked, he asked the question, where does strong introspection come from? He says it comes from good mindfulness, right? And now you can see in more detail what he meant, right? In other words, at the beginning, if you say, oh, I'm going to really try to be introspective, well, you don't yet have the mindfulness even to hold the object. It's not going to be very powerful introspection. But if you develop strong mindfulness where you're no longer losing the object, at level 4 you don't lose it, now you can start to notice, okay, now I'm not losing the object, now I can start to notice, is it clear? Is it dull? Is my mind starting to want to drift away? And can I address it before it even gets that far? Can I, if you think of like, there are different levels of excitation, right? So you start to like notice gradations. Oh, okay, the mind is, I'm not losing the object, but the mind was still had a kind of energy of excitation that was too much, but now I can gradually bring it calmer. You can't yet get rid of the subtle, but you can calm the gross, and so on. And so you can start to use introspection much more powerfully at this point. Yeah, but there's still plenty of laxity and excitement at this point. Then the 5th level is called, he calls it taming. Yeah, taming. And so the quote here, having reflected on the positive qualities of meditative stabilization, you rejoice in it. Since you see the positive qualities, the mind is tamed in stabilization. So one quality of this level, what it says, the positive qualities of meditative stabilization, is at this point, there's a kind of much more intensive pleasure in meditation. Remember I was saying earlier, like from the 2nd level on, you can start to have some little bit of bliss and lightness or pliancy and so on. At this level, at the 5th level, those start to become much more powerful, where the person starts to have great pleasure in their own experience of meditation. And their meditative concentration becomes much deeper. So it says here, some of the notes I made from this one. So one single point of concentration deepens, and the mind is filled with joy. And so that joy kind of naturally subdues or disciplines you. And part of that, I'll say, part of that point about naturally subdued or disciplined is, let's see this right. Ordinarily, in terms of discipline, right, or being subdued or being a disciplined person, like, I'm trying to say it the right way, like, I guess I'll say it this way, like, for the most part, we're motivated by the desire. We're Buddhists sometimes say we live in the desire realm, right, not the form, but the formless realm. So desire is almost continually there, right, for pleasure. And so, people do all kinds of things, right, to try to avoid pain and get pleasure, like all the way up to killing people and stealing and all those kind of things. When a person gets to this level, the level of taming, their main source of pleasure becomes their own meditation, right? So they no longer have to, they're less tempted, maybe is the way to say it, to engage in other external negative behaviors. Like an ordinary person, one has to sort of think and make effort to not, sometimes, if one is tempted to not do something negative, one has to kind of think and go, oh, wait a second, like, that's not a good idea, there will be bad consequences, it'll hurt other people, it'll hurt myself. At this level, it's one's own meditative experience. It's sort of like, it's sort of more like, who cares about that? Like, because like one has an experience like, one no longer looks for one's source of pleasure in other people or food or possessions or, previous to this, hopefully one is already progressing in that, but at this level that becomes so much more powerful, the experience of pleasure in meditation, that those other interests sort of become experientially less relevant. That's what I say. It's no longer like through thinking, it's more of a natural process because it's the actual experience of this intense pleasure. Now at this level though, subtle thinking, like one has overcome most of the gross excitement and gross laxity. So one's meditation is very deep, right? But Lama Tsongkhapa says at this level, subtle laxity becomes a humongous danger, a main obstacle. And this is that level because it's so pleasurable, the person has experience, it's so pleasurable to concentrate, and a kind of subtle laxity, a subtle lack of vividness and clarity still arise often for this person. And it's like, it's so pleasurable to sort of be in that state that they don't mind it. They don't mind the subtle laxity. But it's a trap, right? This is the level where a person can get stuck. And some commentators have said there are many meditators of India and Tibet who just got to the 5th level, so they were actually, they'd gotten pretty far, but then they just stayed there because they never realized they were having subtle laxity. They thought, I'm never losing the object, it's very pleasurable. And they actually mistook sort of the bliss and pleasure of this level for actual bliss and pliancy of calm abiding, which it's not. It's a much less intense and it's a much sort of less powerful experience. But they didn't know that from their own experience, and they hadn't studied it, so they just sort of thought, oh great, I've achieved this. And they kind of stayed in a state of subtle laxity. And that's where earlier in the text, some of you may remember, like Lama Tsongkhapa said, there were meditators who spent years in retreat and who eventually became kind of dull-minded and less intelligent and sort of they didn't gain wisdom. It was because they stayed at this level. They were actually meditators, but they never got beyond the 5th level, and so they never gained insight. Because if you keep that subtle dullness, one is you won't progress to calm abiding, but the other is you're certainly not going to develop special insight then, right, into the nature of reality. You need clarity, right? And so the danger at this level is staying within subtle laxity or a mind that's subtly not vivid enough or not clear enough. And so at this level, again, it's the power that overcomes that is introspection. And it's a kind of subtle introspection of being able to identify the experience for oneself of what is subtle laxity. And then the antidote to at this level, at earlier levels we went through in another class, right? There are all these at a very gross level of laxity, you splash water in your face, or you go look at the sky, or you visualize light. There are many antidotes to laxity at the gross level. At this level, usually the person can just vivify their mind and can just sort of energize their mind a little bit and overcome the laxity. Sometimes they may still go look at the sky or visualize light, but they can just sort of add a little energy and the clarity can come as well sometimes. So then the 6th level is called pacification. And pacification, Lama Tsongkhapa's quote is, "You view distraction as a fault and pacify dislike for meditative stabilization. Seeing distraction as a fault, pacify dislike for it." So here, at the level of pacification, you'll see how it relates to the one right before it. Subtle laxity can still occur at this level, but it's no longer the main obstacle. In other words, the person has practiced long enough with the introspection and sort of vivifying their mind that, first of all, most of the time they have that kind of clarity. Does that make sense? Subtle laxity can still occur, but now the person knows what it's like through experience, no longer intellectually. They know what that's like, they know how to overcome it, they've gotten good at overcoming it. So it still happens sometimes, but they know how to overcome it, and they do overcome it. So it's no longer the main obstacle at this point. They've sort of gotten good at overcoming that, and so that's no longer their main problem. So at this level, subtle excitement is the main problem. So and they go in that order. This is why it's again, it's useful to know this. It's for people who are actually in retreat and doing this kind of thing, is so, and part of that is again, earlier the text has described these kind of things. So the person was having to overcome their subtle laxity because the mind was so absorbed, right? And part of that is, when the mind was so absorbed, there could be that subtle experience of lack of clarity. As the mind gets clearer here, and they overcome the clarity, sometimes there's too much energy. And that's that subtle excitement. So it's no longer an excitement where you're thinking about, oh, I want to go get pizza tomorrow, and you're thinking about the pizza and you're drifting off. It's that you're still on the object and you're absorbed in the object, but there's a little too much energy. The mind is a little too agitated or too sort of energized. And so it's not calm enough. And so, again, the antidote is introspection. It's being able to notice that very subtle quality where it's gone beyond just clarity to a kind of overexcitement or over too much energy in the mind. It's a subtle level of too much energy. And so here the person introspects, notice that, and calms the mind, and sort of calms the mind slightly. Right? They sort of or applying antidotes. There are other antidotes to excitement we went over. They may, again, if it's, they may, I mean, if the excitement is happening repeatedly, they may pause and apply the different antidote and then come back. Like those antidotes, like think about impermanence, think about suffering, those calm the mind and sober the mind, we say. But here, sometimes you could actually stop, or other times you could just sort of notice it, and just noticing it and letting it go could be enough. So either way, depending on the person and where they're at. But that's the level of pacification. And again, the main antidote to that is introspection, of being able to identify that subtle excitement, which you can imagine, right, would be new, right? Right now, we're lucky if we notice gross excitement. Right? At that level, you're kind of becoming much more refined in your introspection. And here you get the real sense of what introspection is, right? It's this ability to subtly distinguish these very subtle differences of concentration and subtle differences of how you're ascertaining the object and how the object's appearing to you, where you start to notice these very subtle differences. And it's like, you know, he said in another part, it's like fine-tuning the tuning of an instrument, maybe like, we said guitar, but maybe better at this point, like a violin or something, you know, something very subtle where you're like, what's this, you know, just that it's an exact right pitch. You know? Then the seventh level is, how does he label it? Thorough pacification, complete pacification. So again, the quote from Lama Tsongkhapa, completely pacifying occurrences of attachment, unhappiness, lethargy, and sleepiness, and so forth. Attachment, unhappiness, and the like should be pacified as they arise. So at this level, the seventh level, what he's getting at there and why it's called thorough pacification is that you thoroughly pacify all your attachment, your mental unhappiness, displeasure, fogginess, sleepiness, lethargy. And we've said that, actually, I've said this before here, like that there comes a point through meditative concentration where the meditator can temporarily suppress their mental afflictions just through the power of their concentration. It's not a permanent suppression, it's not a permanent overcoming of them, because that requires the wisdom understanding the ultimate nature of reality, right? But there comes a point where you can temporarily, just through the power of your meditation and concentration, you can kind of, you have a kind of power of mind that can suppress and sort of suppress the mental affliction so they don't arise. At this seventh level, the person has that power where, like, so in other words, they no longer feel unhappy, they no longer feel attached, they no longer feel anger, they no longer feel, it's not permanent cessations, but it's like it's a kind of suppression of them through the power of their concentration itself, that like those things are too gross, they're gross states of mind, that this mind is so subtle that it sort of thoroughly pacifies them. At this point, mindfulness and introspection are kind of brought to their completion in a way, like in other words, they're sort of perfected, you could say. There's very little subtle, there's just a little bit left of subtle sinking or subtle excitement, but not much at this point. And then it's gradually overcome over the course of this level. Does that make sense? So that's the person's perfecting, that's what it means by they're perfecting their mindfulness, and their introspection is they're kind of overcoming the subtlest bits of sinking or excitement. And one can suppress them easily as soon as they arise. Right, so for this person, that's the skill they're getting, is they can sort of, in some Mahamudra texts they describe that, where the person sort of reaches a level where they can see it just beginning to arise and they can pacify it. So it's not that it doesn't arise at all at this level, but they can sort of see, oh, there's the slightest hint, and they can just correct it right in the moment. And at this level, though, it still takes joyful effort to sustain your meditative concentration. Does that make sense? So it's joyous and it's very pleasurable, and the person is having, they're not having mental affliction, so it's a very wonderful experience. But they still have to make effort and put forth energy to sustain that level of concentration on the object. Then the eighth level is called making single-pointed, and it says making an effort for the sake of effortless engagement, which I like that phrase. Making an effort for the sake of effortless engagement. Then, by means of restraint and effort, along with the actual application, you get it to come about naturally. So at this level, first of all, when it says effort for effortless engagement, what that means is the person at this level, if they sit down for a meditation session, they have to make effort at the beginning of the session. Like, so they have to think, okay, I'm going to meditate on the image of the Buddha. And they make a little bit of effort, and then for the rest of the session, it's effort. Like, the mind remains with its object. And they don't any longer have to rely on mindfulness or introspection. Their mind is so well habituated to meditation that it absorbs. But it's like, it does require effort at the very beginning of the session, of each session. One of the texts was saying different people, some people debate, like some say there's a very little bit of very subtle laxating excitement at the very beginning of this level, and then it completely disappears while you're on the 8th level. Others say at the beginning of the 8th level it's already disappeared. It's a distinction for, I guess, like how you define where that level is, I suppose. But the point being, I think what's important is while you're on the level of single-pointed, there comes a point where there is no longer even the hint of subtle. Like, there's that little subtle hint that you have to pacify. At the 7th level, you're pacifying it right as it arises. Somewhere along whether it's the beginning of the 8th level or partway through the 8th level, there comes a point where those don't even arise anymore. Does that make sense? And that's one of the distinguishing features of the 8th level. So one is it requires effort at the beginning, and then it's effortless. Another is eventually you reach a point where there is no subtle laxity or excitement. There was an interesting description. It says, any conceptual thoughts that arise naturally dissolve into your single-pointed concentration itself at this point. So in other words, like, if there's the beginning of an experience of a discursive thought, it naturally dissolves into meditation. And it happens naturally. You don't have to try to dissolve it. Previous to so in earlier levels, you're having to kind of work with discursive thoughts. Here, there's kind of effortless quality of it dissolving into meditation. One author described that experience. They said, it's like a great, vast, peaceful ocean with a small wave on it that arises and then falls back into the ocean itself. Like, sort of dissolve, there's a slight ripple. You can imagine like a giant lake, right, in the morning with no wind that's completely, what's the word? Like crystalline or like mirror-like. And then if there were like a slight ripple from a slight breeze, it would, like, the ripple would arise and then it would just disappear. That's the experience, I think, at this level with regards to conceptual thoughts. And one's meditation throughout the length of the session is uninterrupted. And one can do that for very long periods of time at this level. And finally, the 9th level. I'll read the quote again. The 9th level is called even placement, and he mentions Kamala-Shila's stages of meditation. In that text, this is said to be equanimity, in which the mind has become even. The instructions of the perfection of wisdom, it is said, to be spontaneous, natural engagement and attainment of control due to the habit of unifying the mind. In accordance with that, also the ornament of Mahayana Sutra says, since it's habitual, there is no application. So there are a number of points he's making, right? One is, at this level, there's no effort at all required. It's effortless, right? And this is the level where that power of equanimity is what's used. So, in other words, at this level, if you're making, the effort itself would be the distraction. Any effort would actually be causing a ripple, right? So there's no effort. And even at the beginning of the session, one absorbs just through the power of one's previous habituation, as it says, to meditation itself, to concentration. No discursive thoughts. At the previous level, there were the slight ripples, right, of discursive thoughts that would then dissolve into meditation itself. At this level, there are no discursive thoughts. So if the person sort of, is going to concentrate on a certain thing for an hour, then for that hour, no discursive thoughts arise, and then they naturally arise from that to do whatever they're going to do. But for as long as they're intending to concentrate, they can concentrate effortlessly and without conceptual thoughts, without discursive thoughts, and so on. And one other point I'll make is this 9th level, just to clarify a point, is in some texts it's called the approximate level to calm abiding. The point being, this is not yet calm abiding. Like, so just to clarify, these are the 9 levels of concentration one goes through if one's cultivating calm abiding. And then as one stays on this level of even placement, right, or one can effortlessly concentrate on the object, one already has, this kind of, we'll go into this in more detail, but one already has experienced a great deal of bliss and so on, pleasure and meditation. But then there comes a point, which I'll describe probably next class, where as one's abiding on this level, then one actually achieves calm abiding. And that's because through the practice of even placement itself, there comes an extremely intense experience of bliss, mental and physical bliss, and mental and physical pliancy, or flexibility, or lightness, or sort of, where one doesn't get tired, one can apply oneself physically and mentally to whatever one wants, effortlessly, kind of, even outside of meditation, that starts to happen. So the even placement is sort of like, like a stage from which one steps into calm abiding, you could say. So that's the 9th level. And again, at that level, that's the level where they say loosen up, or they say like any effort would be an obstacle. The effort itself would be an obstacle. You get the idea. Okay. I mean, that's the kind of presentation of the 9 levels. Any questions about those before I?
So is it possible to get to calm abiding and get stuck there?
What would it mean to get stuck there? Like, what do you say? What you
If
mean?
there's no effort and no tiredness, would you just not return?
Oh, I see what you see. Like,
So like after a while, your body would just stop?
actually, so once one is like we can get into this more another time, but like, so essentially, like once the person has achieved calm abiding itself, right, where their mind has experienced the bliss and pliancy and so on, then depending on who the person is and what their practice is, if they're, what path they're practicing and so on, there are many different things that can happen, but let's say this right, like in the Buddhist context, of course, if the person has bodhicitta, right, then it's the force of bodhicitta itself. In other words, if the person has bodhicitta, then it's like, now the person who has bodhicitta has this incredibly powerful tool, right, a mind that can so the person who has bodhicitta, the force of their bodhicitta, they sort of recognize, through the force of their bodhicitta, they recognize, now I have this powerful tool, now I can do all kinds of things to benefit others, right? And they can, at that point, the person can, if they want to, they can achieve like clairvoyances and other kinds of magical powers, which are called, siddhis. We read about those in text. At that point, it's easy to achieve those things. Also, the person can use that mind of calm abiding to realize special insight and progress through the 5 paths. At that point, the union of calm abiding and special insight is what characterizes the second of the 5 paths. So the person recognizes, now I have this ability to enter the path of preparation, and then the path of seeing. So that the person with bodhicitta would develop incredible enthusiasm, because now they can sort of do all these things they couldn't do before. But even for a person who's not, let's say a person achieved calm abiding who didn't have bodhicitta, because I think that would be more relevant to your question. Even for that person, they start to recognize, that through the force of this mind of calm abiding, that one can enter, because one still isn't, one has been in the desire realm up to that point, right? But then that person, this is where like you read in many Buddhist texts, where they describe like the concentrations, and those mean like, or the 4, sometimes they're called the 4 concentrations of the form realm. And so that person also recognizes then, oh wow, like there are like states of being much more pleasurable than this. They start to see that the realm they're in, being the desire realm, is sort of gross compared to a much more refined state, being the first concentration of the form realm in that case. And they can start to see how that would work or something, which we can't experience, but they can. So at that point, the person then oftentimes will say, wow, I want to experience the 4 form realm absorptions. And they say, actually, how does a person achieve the first of the 4 form realm absorptions? Is they start to see what that would be like, and then they see that their current experience is grosser than that, and is less pleasurable than that. And so there's a process of kind of renouncing where they're at and aspiring to the next level, and then through the force of their concentration, they're able to actually experience that next level, where they're actually free from the desire realm itself temporarily while they're in this state. And then they can see, oh, the second level is more subtle than the first, and they can do that. So there are many descriptions, actually, and these are in Mahayana, but also Theravadan text, or actually they exist also in Hindu texts and so on. These descriptions of different levels of experience that are much more subtle and refined and much more pleasurable than the desire realm and so on. And so even somebody without bodhicitta oftentimes will sort of recognize that, and they'll progress through those, and then one can progress from the most refined, the fourth level of the form realm is the most refined, and then the person realizes, oh, I could have the formless. There are said to be then 4 formless realms, and that's where the mind is concentrated on things like infinite space or nothingness or infinite consciousness and so on. So the person creates a mental image or a mental idea of, for example, infinite space, and then because of their ability to concentrate so well, they can completely absorb their mind in that, and all form falls away from there experientially, and that's said to be even more pleasurable. And so on. So people who are not bodhisattvas and don't have renunciation, for example, they'll sort of aspire to those things oftentimes, and that's where then the person could get distracted, because the danger there, of course, and this is said way back in the teachings in this text on precious human rebirth. It said, a precious human life is much more valuable than a life in the God realms, right? And that's part of what now you can understand in a more detailed way what they're getting at is exactly your question, right? That a person who doesn't have renunciation, wishing for enlightenment, wishing for liberation, personal liberation, and doesn't have bodhicitta, wishing for Buddhahood for the sake of others, that person might just think, well, let me achieve whatever the most pleasurable level I can achieve is through my concentration. And then they do, because they have that concentration. But the problem there, of course, is it's a getting lost. In the sense that if the person just does that, right, and doesn't use the meditative concentration to realize emptiness, and doesn't use it to achieve the ability to benefit others, then they just achieve a great pleasure in this life, and when they die, they go to that realm. Whichever realm they most focused on, when they die, through the power of their meditation, their consciousness just takes a kind of birth in that realm. But the problem there, of course, is that's not that's a birth sort of created through the karma of meditation, that then will run out, and then the person falls back to wherever their next karma is. And that's where they say in many teachings, like the suffering of the person who, if the person thinks they achieved liberation, right, because they've experienced this great pleasure through the force of their meditation, then at the end of that life, they see they're going to take rebirth as like an animal or a hell being or whatever. They say that suffering is actually worse than the suffering of a person in hell, because you had this great pleasure and now you're going to...
Right.
And so you can't. So your answer to your question really is yes. Like it is possible to sort of space out there, and that's why it's actually probably there's that's why the whole question early. I mean that's why partly that's why this comes late in the book, right? Whereas like Lama Tsongkhapa doesn't present this at the beginning of the stages of the path, because the idea is that the person, if one is practicing Buddhism, the idea is that the person would do these practices after they've developed a strong sense of precious of human life, impermanence and death, renunciation of samsara with recognition of the various kinds of suffering that come in samsara, an aspiration therefore to full enlightenment, to at least liberation for yourself, but then especially bodhicitta motivation, wishing for benefit for others. Because then, of course, especially if one has either of those, but if one has renunciation, then the person who has achieved this sees the pleasure of those other realms, but thinks, well, I know that's not going to really liberate me. I want to realize the nature of reality. And then they use the meditative concentration to meditate on emptiness, and they achieve special insight and achieve liberation through that. Or the bodhisattva, of course, uses it to progress to Buddhahood itself, and their bodhicitta, their compassion, overwhelms, and the attachment to pleasures of those other realms and so on. But they use that to realize emptiness, but also to develop those other abilities which allow one to help others more effectively. Does that answer?
Yes, thank you very much. A lot came together there.
Yeah, okay.
Dr. Laura, they don't have to sleep, like they can work forever, 24/7.
Yeah, it seems that people who have calm abiding, and if you like, actually, I guess part of the idea, I think, I'm not 100%. I mean, one is, I'll say two things. One is, if you like, there are, that's not. There are people like Lama Zopa and some other yogis who you can see they don't actually. They don't they don't have. But they get. And part of that, though, is it's a different thing, right? There is, I think part of the idea is that they get their rest through the power of the meditation itself. Like, in other words, they're because the function, sleep has functions for us, right? Which we do need sleep, obviously, for our health. But if the meditative concentration itself gives you energy and rest, I think your body and mind are different. I'll share one very brief story. I'll stop it. I remember one time did I tell the story? I can't remember. But one time I was like trying to work with Lama Zopa Lama Zopa I've seen, like, he's stayed in my house a few times, and I saw he never lays down. Like, he just meditates. Like after a long day, he'll just sit down and meditate, and that's his rest. And one time we were supposed to work on a book together, and so I said, well, how do you deal with being tired? Like if you're stressed and you get tired out, how do you deal with being tired? And he kind of said, like, I'm sorry, I can't honestly answer that. Basically, he used these words. Basically, he said, I'm sorry, I can't honestly answer that because I've not had that experience. And I said, what do you mean you've not had the experience of being tired? And he said, yeah, I've never had that experience yet. He said, maybe ask me again when I'm old. Maybe I'll have the experience, and then I can. Then I could try to answer you. So, like, that's the experience of calm. That's the benefit of calm abiding. That's one of the benefits of calm abiding, is that the person, and like somebody else. Subjectively, that's not their experience. That's what he's describing. That's what he was describing. That subjectively, that person doesn't subjectively have that experience because their mind and body have this lightness and this energy and there's and they don't need to rest in that way because obviously their rest is in a different. Comes from a different source. Meditation itself. Okay, it's 12:30, so we should do let's do the dedication. The supreme jewel bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not diminish, but increase more and more. In this snowy mountain paradise, you, the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara.